Hey everybody, something a little bit special for you today, a physics engine. Woohoo! So I've gotten sick of games like Space Engineers and Minecraft only doing voxel damage. Voxel damage isn't very interesting from an engineering perspective. I really want to see the walls creak and crumble as the storms hit, and I want to see the hull crumple as the ships collide. I want to have the challenge of trying to engineer a ship that can withstand the pressures of running into the ground or trying to land on an 8-gravity planet. But all that stuff doesn't really exist in today's games, and the reason is because it's hard to do physics. So I went ahead and I did some of the hard work for you. This is one layer of a physics engine. It's only the layer that calculates out the internal stresses of any sort of physics event on a modular object. So this doesn't handle things like whether you've collided with a planet. It doesn't handle things like whether you're spinning backwards or whatever else. All it handles is a physics thing's happened, what happens to the inside of your ship or your castle or your giant mech. Let's go ahead and show you. Everybody's got rockets on their spaceship, right? So let's go ahead and turn on some rockets. Rockets will move your ship forward. But what else do they do? Well, moving your ship forward exerts a tremendous amount of force on your ship. You don't ever really see that computed because it takes a lot of effort, right? Well, I've simplified it out for us. Let's go ahead and increase the amount of force that we're using. Doop, 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 doop. Here we go. So these red elements are compression damage. I haven't actually programmed in damage into this yet because these modules don't exist in a game world of any sort. So these red little blobs are stand-ins. And the basic idea here is the ship is pressing itself so hard that those particular modules are taking compression damage. They're being crushed. Sound good, right? Well, that's not supposed to be an instant failure. You will hear alarms and you'll see them getting crushed and dust will fly off or whatever. The player will be able to push his ship past the limits as long as the player stops and repairs afterwards. Or if the limit is too low for their taste, they can always engineer their ship differently. But let's keep increasing our pressure. We can see that we're starting to see damage throughout the ship, the back end of the ship. The reason for that is pretty basic. This object here is the only thing that the rocket engine is mounted onto. So all of the mass of the ship is being piped through this one module. We could fix that by adding in another rocket engine, which we'll do in a second. These are also starting to get crushed. The reason for that is because these tanks are actually mounted to this tank rather than to the ship. And the tank really isn't built to withstand a tremendous amount of pressure. So you're not supposed to mount tanks onto tanks. You're supposed to mount tanks onto ships. So let's fix both of those things and run this simulation again. Let's go ahead and strap one of these tanks to the center there. We'll leave the other one out so that we can see the difference. And let's go ahead and just duplicate this engine system. We're just going to put it up here just for the sake of having it up here rather than... there we go. Rather than having it look good, we're just going to do it fast so that you don't have to wait around. So now we have another set of engines, and this should really change the pressures on our ship. So here's our rocket. The other engine won't show any thrust, but it is thrusting. I just don't have the particle effect set up for it. So you can see that the other tank is taking damage right on schedule. On the other hand, these here aren't taking nearly as much damage as they were last time. And even if we go all the way up, we're not seeing that flurry of damage that we saw before. Now this is taking a little bit more damage because it is more central to the ship and therefore supports more of the mass, but it's not so much. Even at full thrust, we aren't really taking any substantial damage. We're seeing some compressive damage up here as well, but that's because this object is pretty weak. This is bolting along at maximum acceleration, like 8 Gs, and it's handling it fine. So let's go ahead and delete that engine. Boom. Back to where we were. Let's go ahead and unlink this. Boom. And just to show you, just to remind you how it looked before, it looked like that. So there's a big difference. And that kind of engineering is fun. That kind of engineering is like, okay, well, how can I make this work at higher stress levels? Well, this is a modular ship, and any of the modules can have a physics event happen to them. So let's land on a planet. If we pull down some landing legs here, these are obviously just tossed together, so you don't need to make comments about how they're hilarious, although you can if you really want to. Once again, I don't have any of the physics involved in bouncing off of things or spinning, so what I've done is I've locked these legs in place, like they're cemented to the planet's surface. The whole ship is going to try to hang from those legs, and it's not going to spin or anything like that. It's just going to try and sit there, like those tricks you see people on flagpoles holding themselves up sideways. Let's go ahead and see what that does in terms of the pressures of trying to land on a planet like that. All right, so you can see that we're seeing something a little different. This isn't red balls, this is vibration. Vibration is shearing damage. So basically, there's not enough pressure on these to compress them, but there is enough off-center mass to bend them. And just like compression damage, this would slowly damage the blocks on your ship. So if you somehow did cement these objects into the ground, you would find that they would be taking steadily more and more damage as time passes. So the things that are taking damage are these legs and this guy here. The reason is because this guy here has a fairly low shear resistance, so he's specifically built to withstand the thrust of a rocket engine and not holding the entire mass of the back of the ship off of a nail on the back somewhere. But we are also seeing a lot of strain on these legs, and the reason is because the center of mass is way back here, and that means that the center of shearing is down here, and you can see how far that is from our actual leg. So obviously that's not ideal. I mean, duh, right? You don't land with just two front landing legs. But let's presume that we did that for a reason. Let's say that we're coming in real hard in this direction, and we're going to basically be crashing. How do we fare with that kind of situation? Oh, you can see that it happened in a different way. There was no weird bending or anything, and instead what we got is a compression of the these compression systems of the shocks. And the reason for that is because the vector of the pressure is this way. So that means that the actual shearing involved is not very much. The shearing center is very, very close to our center, our connective center, and that means that there's not much shearing pressure. But there is a heck of a lot of compressive pressure. Basically, the whole mass of the ship is riding on these two front legs, and you can definitely see that by how fast they compressed their shock absorbers. We do eventually get some shearing damage, but it's not nearly as much as before. Well, enough of that. Let's actually bring down the other two landing legs, because obviously the point is to land on all four and not just the front two, right? So if we do that, we can lock these two legs in place as well. Go ahead and hit play. And let's see what happens when we land straight down on all four legs. This is three times the force that we were using before, and you can see that they're starting to get a little bit of shearing damage, but there's really nothing terribly wrong happening, and the ship itself isn't ripping apart like it did before. So what happens is the center of mass is adjusted because we have lifters on both sides of the ship, and so you can see that we're not nearly as bad off as when we were just lifting with these guys in the front only. Similarly, each of the landing legs is handling less of a percentage of the overall mass of the ship, so they're not under as much strain. Now, what we're seeing is these starting to break, which makes sense, because as before, these are heavy, and they're not intended to be mounted on each other, so the front one will break when the back one gets heavy, and that's what we're seeing here. You're going to lose your tanks. They're going to rip off the side of your ship before anything else happens. If you get a hard landing, you'll land hard, and then your tanks will go rolling away, and the rest of your ship will be fine. And I think that's great. That's the sort of fun that I want to have while I'm engineering these ships. or these castles, or whatever else I'm doing. I want to have situations where a changing environment and changing forces will change how the ship is being computed and what's happening inside the ship and the sorts of stresses that are on it. That's not all we can do, though. Let's go ahead and remove these legs from their anchoring. De-anchor. De-anchor. And instead, let's say that we got rammed. And let's say that this particular object got rammed and sent to the right. So someone is coming in from the left and crunch, and starts to push us to the right. Now, in a voxel damage situation, those voxels would take damage, and the whole ship would simply move in that direction based on the force applied. In a good simulation, it might even spin a little bit, but there's no calculation of the shock wave that ripples through the ship when that sort of thing happens. Well, that's easy enough. We can calculate the shock wave right now. Cram! That was our shock wave. Now, you may have noticed that the same suspects are suffering here as before. Obviously, the most affected one is this front guy. He suffers not only compression damage, but also shearing damage as the force of the entire ship is bent across. So he's getting pushed this way, so the rest of the ship is effectively getting pushed this way. The front end's not so bad, it's not very heavy, but the back end is pretty bad and heavy. This guy is suffering to a lesser degree because he's a stronger piece and because he doesn't have all of the mass of the ship. He doesn't have his own, for example, applied on him. And obviously the tanks are in trouble. So you can see that this is much more interesting to a designer when you start to have this sort of calculation. Do you want to have a ship that can get rammed? Well, then you need to figure out what sort of pressures are going to be exerted on the other structural elements of the ship. Now, a slightly more advanced computation would be needed for doing this really, really well, because you can set up every connection with their own shearing resistance. Right now I'm using a brick-wide shearing resistance just because it was a little faster to program, but it would be fairly straightforward to actually shear between objects. And that would be a lot more interesting in terms of things like these guys ripping off. But I think that that is a good enough demonstration of the sorts of things this engine can do. If all you care about is that, then this is a good time to stop watching, because I'm about to start to explain how this works, and that's much less entertaining. Alright, I'm going to explain the algorithm now. It's not very complicated to conceptualize, but it is a little bit odd, so I hope you enjoy it. Basically, this works by taking in-world physics sub-objects, or modules, and turning them into graph nodes. This isn't always one-to-one. For example, this turns into a single graph node. But these three guns are all attached to each other as well as to their parent, and they turn into a single graph node. I call it an island. Similarly, if you had a voxel setup, then what you would do is you would chunk a number of voxels into a single graph node. You can do that in a lot of different ways. A basic planar function would work pretty well, but you would end up basically with a certain amount of voxels per graph node, and you could increase that amount as you try to simulate larger and larger objects in order to keep your simulations spry. If you were doing a house, then the four walls that are all connected to each other would be a single graph node. So you might have a roof node, and then the four walls, they're a single node, and then you'd have the foundation. That would be one node as well. So that's how you turn this stuff into graph nodes. Once you have the graph nodes, you need to just calculate out the masses involved and the center of mass at any given node. In order to do that, you do have to know the anchor. In this case, this is the anchor, this rocket engine. Now you can go ahead and recalculate this very, very rapidly. So if you have a set of changing anchors, for example, if you get rammed on one side and then you trip and your left leg hits the ground, that's a sudden anchor change. You're changing from whatever you got hit on to your left foot, and then your left foot stops being an anchor the moment that you bounce off the ground. And so that does have to be recalculated. It can either be cached or recalculated on the fly. It's fairly straightforward to recalculate the graph order. But in the end, what we end up with is an ordered graph, and you can see that in here if you're looking close. It might be hard to see on YouTube. The rocket engine is the base of the graph, and then here we have a 1. That means that it's 1 tier up. Over here we've got 2 and 2, both in colors that are almost impossible to see, and 2. Those are all two jumps away from the rocket engine. Here we've got 3 and 3, and 3 and 3 and 3. So you can see that as we radiate out from the roots, we know how far we are from the nearest root. Down here we're like 8. So that's a very simple way for us to figure out the propagation of force through the object. In order for this to work, the modules have to be roughly the same size. Long supporting objects, like beams, should be broken up into several different objects on the graph, even if they're a single mesh in the game world. That facilitates much more accurate physics simulation, and it also allows those objects to snap in the middle, which is great. So we can have a lot of fun with that, but you do have to make sure that nothing is incredibly large or incredibly small, or this graph needs to be adjusted in some complicated ways that are too annoying to deal with. So once we know the order of this graph, we can easily figure out the masses that are involved every step of the way. For example, this guy here is the end of the graph. He is a leaf node, and he has no masses on him, so he doesn't really care what's going on. He just says, yeah, I weigh 1, and I'm right here. And the graph goes, okay, fine. This guy says, okay, well, I weigh 1, and he weighed 1, so that means that my center of mass is here, and I weigh 2. Then this guy goes, well, I weigh 1, and you both weighed 2, and your center of mass was there, so I weigh 3, and my center of mass is here. But you can see that I've got circled the shouldered mass area because I use that for calculations, and I wanted to know where it was. And as we continue up, we can continue to see more and more operations like that. So here we can see all of your masses combined plus mine is right there, and it weighs a fair amount. And we can get that information all throughout. So my mass is 2 plus my own 2, and it's halfway between us. And my rocket engine has the mass down there, and it's all the mass of the entire ship combined. So that mass graph is independent of any actual forces that are being applied to the object. It just exists, and it can be saved, it can be cached, it can be swapped in and out whenever you need it to do. It can be easily recalculated if it needs to be recalculated for any reason. But the point is that as long as the anchor is what is being, has the force applied to it, this mass graph can instantly calculate out the pressures on the rest of the object. The center of masses have to be recalculated if the object changes its internal configuration. So for example, if I move this guy like this, you can see that the center of mass is still down here. It's just wrong. So that does have to be recalculated, and that can be done automatically, but it's much, much faster than you might think because it's just recalculating a couple of vectors, and vector 3s recalculate very, very rapidly. Once you have this mass graph, you just wait and you sit on it until something happens. When something happens, you can instantly respond by converting that mass into force. Whether you want to do that by finding out how much force is being applied and then translating that into the mass of the ship and then into the individual objects and stuff, or whether you just want to do it gravity style and say that all mass now is moving at 1g that way. Either of those works fine. In the end, you end up with a specific amount of force. The mass has become weight. And that weight can be very, very rapidly turned into an amount of stress on the object. Let's go ahead and hit play and do this live so that you can see it unfold. So what we've done now is I've turned on the engine, and you can see that all of these vectors are getting applied. These green vectors are the total amount of force over and above what the object generally wants to resist. So these are force failures rather than actual force. So you can see the structural elements are starting to fail, and we've also got some excessive force down here and some stuff going on in here. So this force here is only going to be from the end of the leg here. But the reason that it's so long is because the leg isn't intended to take that much force. So it's failing by that much. Either way, we also calculate out the shearing vector. So basically, if we click here, you can see that what we've got is a center of mass. This green ball is right here. That means that the shearing vector for, well, this actually uses the, this actually uses the center of load rather than the center of mass. So the center of load is down here. That you can see it a little bit, that little ball in there, because this is being loaded up with only this leg here. So it takes that load, which is there, and it flattens it onto the plane of the vector, and that's how far the torque is. So it's being pressed from down here. And that means that you end up with a situation where that determines, you multiply that by the amount of force being applied, and that gives you the shear vector. So you have instantly the compression amount and the shear amount, just like you got them. And that's very, very basic. It's not realistic exactly, but it works fast and it's realistic enough for players to enjoy, at least in theory. So if we were to change this from firing in that vector to firing in a different vector, like say upwards, we get a very different set of results. For example, this used to be over here. The shearing vector used to be over here. But since now the force vector has changed, the shearing vector has jumped to over here. That's a substantially longer distance, which reflects the fact that it's extended that direction. So that means that we have more shearing force on this object. And as we continue to move up, you can see the shearing force gets worse and worse. So it's a fairly realistic simulation in terms of feeling realistic. You don't want to design a bridge with it unless that bridge is in a video game, but you're going to get a fairly reasonable set of responses when you're actually playing with it in the game world. And you're going to be able to tell right away when something needs to be fixed or something is taking damage, and that's the point. So I think that that is the basic idea. I mean, I have a 7-page document that's describing this. I don't think that anybody will care that much, but if you really want it, I can send it over to you. It's pretty basic stuff once you understand the concept. The only thing left to explain is when I'm actually applying the stresses here. I'm applying them to the individual objects, not to the islands. So although the graph does keep track of how much force there is with any given island, when I actually apply that force, I apply it to the individual objects. And the reason for that, excuse me, and the reason for that is because that way I can stress individual connections. For example, I can say that this connection broke, rather than saying, oh, well, this object has such and such amount of force being applied to it as part of the island that is taking that damage. So in general, I end up simulating the forces on every single physics object rather than on the individual islands. I just use the individual islands as a very rapid way to quickly define how much force is being applied throughout the ship. This is a very good way to simulate things that need to break. I don't know about very good. It's something. It's a way, and it works for me. If you were doing a voxel system, that would not be how you'd do it. With the voxel system, the islands would be the things that are taking the stress. And it would actually be a little bit simpler, but you'd have to figure out how to apply the damage from the stress to a large block of voxels in a fun way. That would be a fun challenge. You could have walls that fracture in convincing ways because you'd have information about the vector of the force being applied. And you could do things like, okay, well, if the vector is downwards, then we should crack the middle of the wall horizontally. That would be pretty cool, I think. Anyway, that's that. Hope you enjoyed it.